Good evening. This is Jim and Sandra. We're speaking on behalf of New Life International Church, and we welcome you to this evening's devotional. And we will start by reading a couple of verses in 1 Samuel 22, which speaks about David's escape to the cave of Adullam. David left Gath and escaped to the cave of Adullam. When his brothers and his father's household heard about it, they went down to him there. All those who were in distress, or in debt, or discontented gathered around him, and he became their commander. About 400 men were with him.
Here we find David in the cave of Adullam. Previous to this, David had been anointed by Samuel to be king of Israel. But King Saul was jealous of David's popularity with the Israelites, so Saul sought to kill David. We learn that he had spears thrown at him and he had to feign madness in order to escape his enemies. And now we find David in the cave of Adullam in the mountains of Judah. David was a musician who played his harp and wrote beautiful hymns and songs which are collected today in the book of Psalms. We find that whilst David was in the cave of Adullam, he wrote the Psalms 34, 57 and 142. And David used his experience in the cave to get much closer to God. David had a heart after God, but although he was in the cave, he used the opportunity to turn that cave into a prayer closet. Previous to this, David had been fleeing Saul because of Saul's jealousy towards David. David, as we may reflect, was not a perfect person, a perfect man by any means, but yet here he is in the cave due to persecution. Previous to this, David had slain the giant Goliath in the valley of Elah. After this, David had begun to become bitter due to the harassment he was receiving, but he maintains in Psalm 118 verse 9, "It is better to trust the Lord than put our confidence in princes." Whilst in the cave of Adullam, David began to restore his relationship with God, and we read about this in 2 Samuel 22 verse 1. Where David begins to speak to the Lord and he begins his restoration to the Lord. David has now stopped running and fleeing and he turns to the Lord. Whilst in the cave, David did not waste any time, but he used the opportunity to pray fervently. Prayer of a fervent spirit avails much. In the cave, David turns darkness into light. He makes the cave his prayer closet. He turned his loneliness in the cave into a place of praise. He turned his fear in the cave into a place of faith. If we find ourselves in such a similar situation, we should do what David did and turn to prayer and pray as David done in a fervent manner. In the Bible, many biblical figures had a cave experience. Moses spent 40 years in the desert. Joseph was found in the Pharaoh's dungeon. Daniel in the lion's den. Jonah in the belly of a whale. And of course we find Paul clinging to driftwood, and eventually Paul finds himself in jail. We ourselves may from time to time experience our own cave of Adullam. It might be a spiritual cave, a health cave, perhaps a cave of financial difficulties, loneliness, depression, anxiety, especially in these troubled times. Sometimes, however, when we go through a bad patch, then we can use that experience to minister to others who might find themselves in such a situation. There is nothing worse than sitting in your dark cave thinking that everything you depend on is gone. But God transforms lives so that we can fulfill his plan. But David is not alone in the cave, as God is with him. When David trusts God, people begin to arrive at the cave. We read in 1 Samuel 22 verse 1, the first to be restored to David was his family. Next we see that David says he does not have an army to defend himself. And in verse 2, God brings him those who were in distress, those who were in debt, and everyone who was discontented. And these people amounted to 400. God begins to bless David in a special way, and eventually his small army begins to conquer other armies.
I'm going to read Psalm 142, the first 5 verses, which is a prayer from David when he was in the cave. I cry aloud to the Lord. I lift up my voice to the Lord for mercy. I pour out before him my complaint. Before him I tell my trouble. When my spirit grows faint within me, it is you who watch over my way. And in the path where I walk, people have hidden a snare for me. Look and see, there is no one at my right hand. No one is concerned for me. I have no refuge. No one cares for my life. I cry to you, Lord. I say, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living.
David writes in the cave and he begins his restoration, but somehow he finds himself defenceless. In Psalm 142 verse 4, we see that David says there is no one to the right of him. This is because in the courts of law at that time, the defence counsel was at the right hand of you and the prosecution was to the left. But in that place of refuge, David learned to depend and to rely on God. David gives us an indication of how his life is turning around in the cave, and for God, he will also turn our lives around so that we can fulfill his plan. It does not matter how big our mistakes are, the power of God is always greater. I just want to finish by saying, it does not matter how deep the cave you might find yourself in, God will meet you there in that particular depth. And it does not matter how dark the cave that you find yourself in, God will be the light, a light in your experience. May God richly bless us as a church and to all the people in these troubled times. Amen.
Amen.